Minimalism is a kind of a philosophy of simple living, and it was begun in somewhere around in the early 2000s, let's say around 2006, I believe, by somebody named Leo Babauta, who does a blog on Zen living. There are lots of, you will see similarities between minimalism and aspects of Zen and Buddhism in general. And basically minimalism is a reaction to what we might term conspicuous consumption, which is a term that was brought forward many years ago to describe the way that wealthy people consume conspicuously and openly in order to indicate their position in the dominance hierarchy, if you like. In order to get across their status, they consume conspicuously. They buy lots of things. They own lots of things. And so minimalism is a kind of a reaction against that kind of consumerism, if you like. A way of getting beyond consumerism and focusing on what's really important in our lives, rather than on these kinds of incidental things, such as owning lots of stuff. The notion of acquiring things in order to display status or to cement status is something that's been with humanity since the beginning. Indeed, even in hunter-gatherer societies, people who are of higher status tend to have certain possessions that other people don't. This is something that has been with humanity for a long time. So I don't want to say that it is the construction of, let's say, 20th century or 21st century consumerist advertising, but consumerist advertising certainly has made things worse. That is to say, the general notion of an ad campaign is to push on us the idea that status does indeed come from ownership, that through owning a particular kind of thing, we can display status and wealth, and so, in a sense, purchase status simply by buying things, which makes status seem easy to attain, and indeed the sort of thing that we should be trying to attain. But this kind of consumerism, as I think many of us probably know, can lead to a kind of psychological emptiness, a sense at the end of the day that we haven't really done anything. All we've done is to spend money and gain physical objects, which at the end of the day we can't take with us. That is to say, minimalism, the word may sound particularly ascetic, like we're supposed to not own anything. Now, within Buddhism, in particular early Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism today, and many forms of monastic Buddhism, we aren't supposed to own anything. Indeed, the ideal of Buddhism is an ideal of non-ownership, where we are monastic, we do not own anything at all. However, Buddhism also coexists nowadays and in the past with a great lay community as well, who were expected by the Buddha himself to own things. There was nothing wrong with that. Indeed, they were supposed to support the Sangha with donations of food and clothing and other things. So minimalism is a lay project. It's not a monastic project. In other words, minimalists are not people who are ascetics. They are people who understand that the downsides of consumerism and buying too much, and who, as a result, want to balance that. So as I think I remember hearing one person say on a video, if you're giving away things or throwing away things that give you true pleasure, then you're doing it wrong. You're not really doing minimalism correctly. So part of the issue is to find what things in your own life give you pleasure and what things that you need, obviously, to live, and not to become minimalist to the extent of getting rid of those as well. Again, this is a lay project, not a monastic project. Now, there have been a number of articles, I think it's fair to say, articles and videos that have pushed back, that have found things that they don't agree with about minimalism. And I think it's worth looking at one of these in particular that I think that resonates at least with me. And that's a video that was done recently called "Minimalism is More Than Just a Style." And in this video, I don't know the person who made the video, because it was made by a person under the name of an organization. I'll put a link to it down below if you're interested in seeing it. But basically the point that this person makes is that Minimalism runs the danger of becoming a sort of a tightly curated aesthetic, an aesthetic of a certain kind, to make for the wealthy, basically. In other words, it could become a kind of a Zen for the wealthy, where yes, we get rid of a whole bunch of stuff, but what we end up doing is getting rid of a bunch of lower class stuff or less expensive stuff in order to buy the very few very expensive, very high status items. And this kind of thing, to be fair, has happened many times in the past. I believe even now that I'm thinking of it, in 16th century Holland, the Dutch used to wear what were very, very sober kinds of garments so as not to be flashy and in a certain sense to be minimalist. But as a result, the people who were wealthy found ways around this by embroidering them in particular ways that gave signs to other people that this garment, even though it looked very simple and sober, was in fact extremely expensive, and so was itself a kind of a symbol. And there is always a danger with a thing like minimalism that it becomes a kind of another kind of consumerism, just a different kind, where we're consuming, let's say, instead of consuming 5 or 6 Fords, we're consuming one Maserati, and really there's not a whole lot of ethical difference between those two. And ethics aside, it's really not much better anyway for our psychology. The upshot here is that it's very difficult to escape status. Status tends to stay with us. I think it's very, very deep in human history. Indeed, status even exists in non-human animals. So it's the sort of thing that is with us biologically, this desire to have status and to keep status. And it's something we have to be aware of. And the highest status in human society tends to be, let's say, the king, the ruler, the person with the most stuff, in some sense of stuff, where the stuff is actual physical objects, money, wealth, but also the ability to use that wealth to control things, to make the world the way they want to, insofar as anybody can. And what early Buddhism tries to do, though, is to undermine or push against this entire way of conceiving status, as even the way of conceiving it as being beneficial in some sense. And there's an early sutta, which I will put a link to down below, which talks about a king. I believe he was a Brahmin, a king, either a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, doesn't really matter, a king called Bhaddiya. And Bhaddiya, at one point, decided to renounce the kingship and to join the Sangha, to become a Buddhist monastic and live in the forest. And it's said that when Bhaddiya was out in the forest, the other monks would hear him alone sitting in the forest saying, "Oh, what bliss, oh, how wonderful." And the monastics, the other monks, were concerned that what Bhaddiya was doing while he was in the forest was reminiscing back on his time as king, remembering his time in the palace, remembering the beautiful women that he was with, remembering the great food that he'd had, remembering the wonderful garments that he wore and the beautiful things around him in the palace. And so they were concerned that he was spending his time either remembering these things or lamenting not being around them in a certain sense. And so they went to talk to the Buddha and said, this man Bhaddiya, who was, I suppose at the time, relatively new to the Sangha, he's out there in the forest and he's talking to himself in this strange way, and we're concerned about him. And so the Buddha asked Bhaddiya to come and talk to him. He requested Bhaddiya come and talk to him. And when Bhaddiya got there, the Buddha asked him directly. He said, I've heard from these monastics who've been out there in the forest with you that you're sitting there saying how blissful and how wonderful. And why are you saying these things? Is it because of your time in the palace, or why? And Bhaddiya said, when I was king, O Buddha, when I was king, I had guards with me in the room. I had guards posted within the walls of the palace. I had guards outside of the palace. I had guards in the town. But even so, I never felt safe and secure. I was always concerned. I was always worried for my own safety. I was always worried for losing control and losing power. I always lived in fear. And indeed, I always lived with distrust. I distrusted people around me because I always could think of the ways that they would try to undermine me in one way or another and steal what I had. And he says, now that I have renounced that and moved into the forest among the monastics, I no longer have to worry about that. I live in constant bliss. I live without worries. He says, I live the life of a deer, of a stag in the forest that can wander where it wants to and doesn't have to worry. And so he says that is why when I'm here in the forest alone or with the other monastics, I say to myself, or sometimes it just comes out, what bliss, how wonderful it is to live that kind of life. And this is, I think, in a nutshell, the early Buddhist approach to these very questions, the questions, let's say, of minimalism. It is actually better to, in some sense, to live a life where we don't own anything or own almost nothing. Now, we may not all agree with Buddha to that extent. We may say, look, there is a sort of a happy medium for us lay people. And I think that's the point within the minimalist enterprise, where we understand that there is a nice happy medium that we can come to. But the general point is the same, which is that owning all of this stuff that needs to be created for us, this maximalist kind of consumption, is destroying the planet, or at least it's not making the planet any better. It's, at the root, it's the sort of thing that's causing problems with global warming and other kinds of environmental issues. And at the end of the day, it's not making us any happier. So it's time to get rid of that addiction that we have, or at least to push back on it, to work on it. And I think minimalism is one way towards that. And as I say, it doesn't seem as though there's really a difference, though, when it comes to pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, whether we're living minimalist or maximalist lives. So what I want to do is to sort of discuss this a bit and then come back to the issue of minimalism at the end, or nearer to the end. First of all, we can see that there is a problem with living a sort of an indulgent, what we might call a maximalist lifestyle. The Buddha himself describes this. He describes how before he was enlightened, when he was still a relative youth, he lived a life of what we might call luxury back in the day. That is to say, he says he had different lotus ponds just for him, in each pond a different colored lotus, that he had the finest clothes, the finest sandalwood, the finest food. He says that he was provided with 3 different houses, one for each season, the summer, the winter, and the rainy season, which are the 3 seasons in India of the day. He says that he was entertained by musicians, all of whom were female. So we have some idea of indulgence, perhaps sensual indulgence, over a period of years during his youth. And we can think of, but it's also, I think, should be clear that they're lifestyles built around the avoidance of pain. And there are various ways that this avoidance comes true. Some of the most apparent ones are indulgence in drugs and alcohol and various forms of delusion like that. But there also are more insidious ways, ways of just keeping ourselves busy, partying, traveling, just regular kinds of busyness that occupies the mind and so keeps us from thinking about whatever kinds of pain are really lying underneath what we're experiencing. One of the classic ways, I think, that most people try to avoid pain is simply by shutting it out, by either pretending it doesn't exist or by diverting themselves from it so they don't have to look at it. And by remaining busy, I think a lot of us, indeed even in our jobs, which may not seem indulgent, but nevertheless may amount to a form of indulgence, we spend our time doing these things, these jobs, which we may not enjoy because at some level we are thinking to ourselves that they're keeping us from having to look at whatever it is that's underlying it all, which is a kind of pain. And these approaches, it should be clear, foster delusions. They foster delusions on both sides. They foster delusions about the importance, the goodness, the satisfactoriness of the pleasures that we're really going after. And they also foster delusions about the lack of pain, because the pain is really still there, we're simply looking away from it. Now, that is a description of what we might call the maximalist lifestyle, the indulgent lifestyle, but the same kinds of issues, or similar ones at any rate, come up even in a relatively minimalist lifestyle. And here I'm thinking in particular of Marie Kondo. If you don't know her, she is a sort of a personality who is well known for minimalism, a kind of minimalism, for tidying up our lives and throwing away the inessential. I did a video as well on her, and I'll put a link to that down below in case you don't know her or would like to know more, would like to know how she might relate to Buddhism and other things. And her approach isn't simply about throwing away the inessential and the stuff we don't need, but rather about retaining those things that, as she says, spark joy. That is to say, she's trying to distill our lives down to those things that spark the most pleasure in us, so that we end up being surrounded only by the things that are most pleasurable, and less by the things that simply clutter things up and, as a result, perhaps block our views of what is most pleasurable. So this as well is a way of living a more pleasurable life, of pursuing pleasure, if you like. And in the same sense, I think minimalism as an aesthetic movement, which sort of got going in the mid-20th century, although roots, of course, long back before that, but in any event, is an aesthetic movement based around a notion of purity, of clarity, of sort of limpidness, of being able to see the true nature of things by having things less cluttered. The idea being that there is a sort of an aesthetic benefit or purity to simply seeing the way things are in their simplest form, rather than sort of messing things up with a lot of clutter. And so the very, we should say, famous or well-known the architect Mies van der Rohe, who built a lot of buildings, particularly in Chicago, skyscrapers, he was well known for his expression, less is more, in the sense that as you pare things down and make things simpler, there is a benefit, let's say, in aesthetic pleasure. That's one way to look at it anyway. The point here being, though, that minimalism itself is a kind of pursuit of pleasure. It's a pursuit of a particular kind of pleasure, a particular kind of subtle pleasure, if you like. Even the Buddha himself had his preferences. He preferred quiet over noise, in particular the noise of monastics chattering with each other. He preferred deep states of meditative absorption. He preferred to be by himself sometimes. So it's not to say that even awakened beings don't have their preferences. It's simply to say that they become less attached, or indeed, to some extent, perhaps completely unattached to these preferences. That is, there's no particular emotional attachment to them. They simply exist as the ways that you would prefer things, but if they don't happen, they don't happen. The subtler pleasures that we might see in, let's say, a minimalist, or in, let's say, a monastic, there is an extent to which these are somewhat easier to get rid of than the more maximalist pleasures that we saw before of the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha when he was before he was awakened, with all of his surroundings and different palaces. That is a lifestyle which really does attach us more to the world than a more minimalist lifestyle would, at least potentially. Now, why do I say that complex or maximalist pleasures are stickier, are more problematic. One of the reasons is that they are involved more directly in issues of social hierarchy. That is to say, that one of the pleasures involved with maximalism, like we saw before, is that it is a display of our own wealth, power, influence. Being able to afford or being able to find a way to achieve certain pleasures, it may not even be a matter of money, but simply a matter of connections, demonstrates our position in a social system. And that positioning, particularly if we think of ourselves as at the summit of this or near the summit, enters into enormous issues of personal identity. That is to say, we become very involved, self-involved in our positioning. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel better than other people. There's an enormous amount of conceit involved in that, which is resolved by, or which is displayed through, this kind of what we might call, or what has been called in the past, conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is only apparent in these kinds of maximalist lifestyles. It's less so when we get to the minimalist lifestyle. And so, as a result, since these maximalist lifestyles are so caught up in issues of society, they can be, to that extent, at least to one extent, much more difficult to get rid of, because we would have to also be getting rid of, to an extent, our own social status. And this is one of the things that strikes us when it comes to the Buddha, is that he was willing to give up this high social status. Now, there are other factors as well that I think we also have to keep in mind that rub both ways. So it's not simply a matter of status. Another issue has to do with views. And this is one of the ways I think that minimalism also can be very sticky as a viewpoint, is that any position that we find ourselves in can become very associated with views. That is to say, it's not simply a matter of the physical or perceptive pleasures that we gain through, let's say, minimalism, through a minimalist lifestyle, being surrounded only with things that spark joy, or only with a building that only shows its skeleton and so on. But rather that if we are a certain sort of intellectual, let's say, we may get caught up in all of the stories that surround these approaches, these aesthetic approaches. We may get caught up in the stories about clarity and purity and authenticity. And as a result, we attach to the viewpoints. We attach the viewpoints more than perhaps we even attach to the pleasures involved, might actually have thought. But all that aside, the main point here is that any viewpoint, any particular philosophy, any particular strategy that we use can become an object of clinging if we cling to the views, if we cling to the beliefs around it. Now, that's not necessarily to say that the beliefs are delusional or false. They might be true. Indeed, it may very well be that minimalism, in some respects, involves a kind of clarity and limpidness to life. There's nothing necessarily false about that. But insofar as we make that an object of clinging and become attached to it and think of it as mine and something that as a result I'm going to become emotionally involved with and defend and so on, it is to that extent less skillful.
Having lots of money and material possessions doesn't necessarily make someone rich. Often, but not always, wealthy people crave to accumulate more while being afraid of losing what they have. They live with stress, mistrust of others, and sometimes are entirely isolated from the masses who aren't financially well off. These people may successfully accumulate material wealth, but in many cases, this doesn't happen without significant sacrifice. For example, someone working 80 hours a week hardly has time to relax, and there's only a little time left to spend with family and friends. The latter, Epicurus believed to be one of the essential sources of well-being. Moreover, according to a study in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, consistently working more than 40 hours a week is detrimental to our health, as the risk of coronary heart disease increases significantly. Another study, published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, found that working more than 45 hours a week for at least 10 years was associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Of course, not all rich people overwork, and not all people who overwork are rich. But there's a correlation. A book named The Way of Zhuangzi, written by Thomas Merton, contains a series of the author's own versions of Zhuangzi's classic sayings. The Taoist philosopher observed how the world values money, reputation, long life, and achievement. The world condemns lack of money, a low social rank, a reputation of being no good, and early death. More than 2 millennia later, nothing has changed. As Zhuangzi stated back then, people seek things the world values and avoid what it condemns. And if they are deprived of what they seek, they experience panic and despair. I quote, "They are so concerned for their life that their anxiety makes life unbearable, even when they have the things they think they want. Their very concern for enjoyment makes them unhappy. The rich make life intolerable, driving themselves in order to get more and more money, which they cannot really use. In doing so, they are alienated from themselves and exhaust themselves in their own service as though they were slaves of others." End quote. And so, there seems to be significant downsides to the concept of working hard to play hard. Is the playing worth the work? And if not, and we choose not to chase what the world values, are we then condemned to a life of misery? Or can we perhaps find cheaper pleasures that provide the same satisfaction? Some people would argue that the American transcendentalist philosopher Henry David Thoreau was a minimalist. He lived at Walden Pond in a small cabin for 2 years, with only the necessities like a bed, a desk, a table, and a few chairs. He wrote down his experiences during his stay, later published in a book named Walden. On March 11th, 1856, Thoreau described in his journal a contempt for wealth and traveling compared to the simple life and the streams, woods, and natural phenomena he encounters in his own village. He figured that if he would let himself get used to luxury, distant travel, or the tastes of fine wine or brandy, then those things become more and more to him, and the simple things less and less. He would need expensive pleasure to satisfy his needs. As an example, he stated that exchanging the city of Paris for his native village would be a quote-unquote wretched bargain. And yes, the hassle and the increased cost of living are consequences of developing a taste for things beyond our necessities. The easily accessible enjoyments may then move to the background and may be considered uninteresting, boring, and insufficient to satisfy our needs. We got ourselves hooked on expensive pleasures, which also come with higher prices. Furthermore, some people may be hooked explicitly on the idea that the things they enjoy are expensive. The actual pleasure these things provide is secondary. Thoreau stuck to the most common events and everyday phenomena, like what his senses perceived during his daily walks, conversations with his neighbors, and the sight of marsh hawks in Concord meadows. He wrote, "In this sense, I am not ambitious. I do not wish my native soil to become exhausted and run out through neglect. Only that traveling is good which reveals to me the value of home and enables me to enjoy it better. The man is the richest whose pleasures are the cheapest." End quote. We could say that the wealthiest person isn't the one who has the most, but the one most satisfied with what he has, and that being full of desires to be fulfilled is poor, but being content is rich. "If thou wilt make a man happy, add not unto his riches, but take away from his desires," Epicurus once said. But what are these cheap pleasures Thoreau speaks about? How can we enjoy life with minimal cost? There are different ideas on what cheap pleasure entails, as pleasure is different for everyone, and whether or not something is cheap depends on one's circumstances. The 19th century author, geologist, and evolutionary thinker Robert Chambers, for example, stated in a journal that reading is an inexpensive way of deriving pleasure. He stated, Reading, in fact, is nowadays almost as free as air. It would thus appear that all the best pleasures are the cheapest. Nature seems to tell us that we have only to restrain our wishes to what is good and pure and elevating in order to be satisfied without cost." End quote. Chambers' suggestion is in line with Arthur Schopenhauer's views on pleasure. In one of his essays, he argued that the highest pleasures are the pleasures of sensibility, or intellectual pleasures, such as thought, a taste for poetry, learning, reading, and meditation. According to Schopenhauer, all other pleasures that are not of the intellect are of a lower kind. They're always satisfied at the cost of pain. Intellectual pleasures are often very cheap. Those who enjoy them can consider living in today's day and age a blessing, as food for the intellect is widely available and basically free of cost.